Well, good afternoon, everyone. With what appears to be just a few days left in the session, I want to talk a little bit about where I think we are. At the beginning of the year, I asked the legislature that we work together on 3 priorities affecting Vermonters right now: housing, affordability, and public safety. Given what we've all heard from Vermonters, I'm disappointed with the lack of progress on all 3. Take housing. While some legislators on both sides of the aisle have been true champions for housing Vermonters can afford, it's clear it was not a top priority for the legislature as a whole. If it were, we'd have spent more time on bills to increase housing stock instead of an incredible amount of time on a bill that actually expands regulation in the vast majority of the state, especially in rural areas of Vermont. All session, I ask that we keep the housing and conservation bills separate. But even when they've combined them as a political strategy, I was willing to try to find a way to make it work. The Senate has worked with us in some areas, and while far from perfect, they sent the bill back to the House, where we hoped to further improve the bill. But it appears last-minute changes could make it even worse. We've offered multiple paths forward, including a number of compromises on my end. And we've continued to meet with House members today to see if we can reverse some of the areas of disagreement. So it remains to be seen if housing is a priority many claim it to be. On affordability, I'll start with some good news. Although I still believe it spends a bit too much, the budget appears to be on a path to something I can live with. This has been a rare example over the last 2 years where legislators chose to work with me and my team, and again, although it's nowhere near perfect from my perspective, I think it can work. Unfortunately, that's not the case with the yield bill, which sets property tax rates. I've been clear. Vermonters simply cannot afford a historic double-digit property tax increase. Whether it's an average increase of 15% or 12.5%, it's still way too much, and I cannot accept it. And voters are showing their concerns as well. And the lack of action in this building has put school boards in a tough spot. The frustrating part is it didn't have to be this way. We've seen this train wreck coming for years, and we certainly saw it when the December 1st letter came out. And I've offered a path forward that could soften the blow in the short term, while giving us time to work together to implement the structural changes and give school boards some tools to contain costs in a way that encourages and ensures better outcomes for our educators, kids, and families. It appears the legislature will instead move forward with historic increases and little long-term cost containment, other than kicking the can down the road with more studies, leaving schools with hard choices and cuts right now, and taxpayers with double-digit tax increases. And we know we'll be right back in this situation again next year. We need to take the time right now to address the educational crisis, not 2 years from now. There are many other bills where we've offered constructive paths forward, but have been ignored, like the Renewable Energy Standard, which will unnecessarily increase Vermonters' electric bills by hundreds of millions of dollars. I wish, instead of spending so much time and so much effort debating how to increase costs on Vermonters, the legislature would focus on how to make it easier to stay in Vermont and more attractive for families to move here and for businesses to stay here and move here as well. That's what I'll continue to focus on and how I'll consider bills that come to my desk in the coming weeks. With that, I'll open up to questions.
Going back to 8687, it's going to be on the House floor this afternoon. Right before we walked in, Representative Amy Sheldon walked out. I guess, did you speak with her? Did you walk away with seeing anything?
I did not speak with her, but we had members of the staff speaking with her about paths forward. We'll see what will come of that. Just don't know at this point.
And I mean, it's very late in the game. I mean, are there any tangible examples, if you can give us something you would like to see on the House floor this afternoon?
There's all kinds of things we would like to see inserted in the bill. A lot of them both trying to have more housing available in the short term, but also more cost containment in the long term as well. Or not cost containment, but permit regulatory improvements in the future. Because I see this as a short-term gain and but a long-term negative in some respects. Having so much of our state having to go through a regulatory process, Act 250, and will impair, I believe, the rural parts of our state. So we're trying to make some adjustments there and have both, but we're still talking.
And there are some exemptions, though, in that Tier 1A, 1B. Would you call that progress at all, or just it's not enough?
Well, again, you have to weigh the good and the bad. From my perspective, if, and they've made it worse by actually becoming more aggressive and not putting off some of these regulatory changes to the future. By a year or two more than what we had hoped for. So again, you have to weigh that out. The short-term gains are good, and we need more housing, as we've consistently said. But if the negatives outweigh the positives, we'll weigh that out and decide what to do.
Governor, we've been working on Act 250 for a number of years now. It's been studied several times. I mean, what's the chance that everybody walks away, from this legislative session empty-handed?
It's probably 50-50 at this point, from my perspective. But they have the supermajority. I mean, they've proven that over and over again. I mean, they don't need me. They can override any veto I put in place.
As complex as the Act 250 conversation has been over the past few years, I think some would say the education funding, the long-term education finance reform conversation might be complex as well. How do you expect that conversation to go over the next, let's just say, 3-5 years, seeing what you've seen over the past few years with Act 250?
So are you separating Act 250 from everything else?
What lessons, I guess, can you glean from the Act 250 reform conversation we've been having for the past 5 or so years and applying that to education finance and our schools?
Well, all of that is difficult. I mean, on both sides, in both of those examples, we've talked about educational finance reform and cost containment and education spending for the last 8 to 10 years. And we haven't gotten very far. We've been ignored in some respects. So now we're in the situation we're in with a historic tax increase. And that's gotten the Vermonters the attention it probably deserves. Because it affects their pocketbooks, right? They may not understand how we get the educational formula, but they certainly understand a tax bill they can't afford. And so it's the same situation here in some respects, but it's more long-term. They won't understand. They'll see the short-term with Act 250, the short-term gains associated with that. But it's not going to be long if they have their way, especially with the House measures they're putting forward, that in 2 years' time, most areas of the state, the rural areas of the state, will be impacted. And you won't be able to build a whole lot without an Act 250 permit.
Just as a follow-up on the education finance funding, you had talked about your administration has floated a number of proposals over the years. Has the Agency of Education done any modeling or have any estimates of how much money that would have saved us, or how much, dollars and cents that would have brought down education spending?
I'm sure we have some of that information, but we can't keep going to the past. We have to look to the future. But we know some of the changes that need to be made, and I think now some in the legislature see that and agree with that. I was encouraged when the House came out, when they floated their yield bill to begin with, but quickly pulled that back and then put off some of the changes, put a study into place, an 18-month study that to take a look at some of the initiatives that we all agree need to be addressed right now, because it can't wait. I mean, you put a study in place for 18 months, and you're looking at 3 years before, by the time you get the study back and put that into place, and the legislation and everything that we've been going through over here in this building will happen again. So you're looking at best, 3 years, and this isn't going away. That we're going to see another December 1st letter next year that I think is going to be similar to what we saw this year if we don't make structural changes today. So that's why it's so critical that we have this conversation right now. We accelerate that study, provide some relief to taxpayers however we can, and give us a little time to have this study, a 6-month study, not an 18-month study, and then put things into place next year.
Is that realistically what you think could happen in the final days of the session? You're not suggesting necessarily that they take up some of your cost containment measures in the next 72 hours.
No, I don't believe that's being realistic.
So what are you really saying?
What I'm saying is accelerate the study, not an 18-month study. Make it like 5-6 months. We've proven in this building how quickly they can react. I mean, this massive Act 250 conservation bill was put together in 2-3 months? It seems like we could do something with known facts about educational financing reform that we've kicked around for the last decade could be put into place too. So accelerate the study, come to some agreement by the next legislative session, and then put that into place. In the meantime, this deferment we've been talking about, or some variation of the deferment, providing for tax relief. I mean, I was encouraged working with the House and the Senate on the budget bill, the conference committee, being able to put $25 million in there for costs for property tax relief, but we need more. And we've had some ideas about that, but we also feel as though we can do something to defer those payments. So we're still working on that, and we hope we'll see some movement.
Are the tax increases a problem for offsetting some of the property taxes?
Like the DFR fees?
I thought there was a short-term rental tax. And
It was a
cloud
streaming tax. The streaming tax we were successful in taking out.
Okay.
That was one of our asks, and they did that. And the EFR fees are still in there. But those are more difficult to argue against when you have real life, like the streaming tax would affect, somewhat of a regressive tax, would affect Vermonters instantaneously. And we've had enough of that, I believe.
There is a software tax in there, software use tax in the yield bill as proposed yesterday.
Yes,
That's there.
yes, I believe so. It's hard to follow all the moving pieces in the yield bill, or any bill at this point.
Governor, are you aware of the Tap Trees Not Vermonters rally scheduled for here tomorrow? Have you been asked to attend, and what do you think of this coalescing tax protest?
I wasn't aware of it, so suffice it to say that I'm not aware that I was invited.
I just want to be clear on the yield bill. If that 18-month study was changed to 6 months, you would support the bill?
Oh, no, I
No.
didn't say that.
Okay.
That's one of the suggestions along the
All
way. Actually, that would help. At least having that instead of extending it to an 18-month study, having a 6-month study, that would be helpful. But we need the structural changes talked about. We also need deferment. We need property tax relief right now. So that would all have to be worked in as well.
Seems like one of the disagreements between, with the deferment plan is about what effect potentially, if at all, it could have on our credit rating. You've said that the credit agencies take into account the affordability and the trajectory and sustainability of our state. The treasurer has said loaning out money to ourselves essentially could also hurt. Have you had any direct conversations with the treasurer of how you square those?
I have not spoken with him directly, but our team has. And, I still believe that there's a path forward there. It just depends on the question and how we put it into place. And there's an interesting proposal I heard in the last 24 hours that could work, and I'm not prepared to talk about it, but there's something there that might be helpful. But as I said before, I've been part of these rating agency briefings and meetings for the last 7 years and further. In fact, I was participating in some when I was in the Senate as well as a chair of a money committee. So it's been consistent, their concerns. They're concerned about our demographics, the affordability of Vermont, a somewhat of a collapse of our educational finance system certainly would get their attention. This will get their attention as well. So, we may see a downgrade if we do nothing. And as I've said before, I want to give Vermonters relief. I want to help the school boards and the communities out as well. If we went with some sort of deferment, we might not have all the debates we're having right now and all the votes on some of the school issues, because we could defer some of that payment.
But if you did a deferment and you used some surplus money to buy down the statewide property tax rate, aren't you also guilty of kicking the can down the road?
But I'm saying put in the structural reforms if we could, but certainly accelerating that time frame to have those discussions. It all has to be tied to structural reform, or it's all for naught. And I would agree. If we don't have any serious conversations about structural reform, there's no sense in buying down those rates with surplus money. That doesn't help the situation, because we'll be back here as well.
Governor, have you considered calling the legislature back for a special session this summer for a short period of time?
I think we might have a session coming up in June that would suffice.
To solve the ed funding issue,
Maybe.
though? Do you think, should they extend the veto session and just stay here until it's done?
We'll see. There's still time to come to agreement here. So I think, and knowing that there's a pretty good chance to be coming back in June, that'll give us time in between to have more productive conversations.
Lawmakers are actually pretty proud of themselves for getting the 20% tax increase down to 12.5 because of the cloud tax and the $25 million you mentioned and the short-term rental fee, which I think they doubled it recently in order to get it down to 12.5. Why are you not satisfied with that, I guess?
12.5%. That's why I'm not satisfied. I mean, in the past, I had concerns over an increase of 4 or 5% in years past. 12.5%. This was on top of the 8% they had last year. I mean, when are Vermonters going to say enough is enough and say, I can't afford to live here. I love my state. I want to stay here. I want my family to grow up here, but I simply can't afford it. When's that day of reckoning? I think it's sooner rather than later if we continue along this path. Fewer kids in the education system. not getting enough money to the kids. You know, we need structural reform, and it doesn't mean just cutting. It means just more efficiency, more structural reform, making sure that, you know, classroom sizes are bigger. It could mean having, you know, co-locating schools and so forth. I mean, there's all kinds of things. We want to help the municipalities get through this. And we can do it together, but we have to have a path. We have to have a plan to do that.
Most people, when they hear that, think school closures, that you're thinking that's
Yeah, that's
some
not,
smaller, no.
I'm not saying that it's not, there will be some, there would have to be some, but that's not what we're talking about. There's other ways to find efficiencies, and there's other ways to have structural reform without closing schools. But we have to have that conversation.
Back to the Act 250 bill for a second. Why is it that the interim exemptions for virtually all of the communities in the state for projects near the downtowns, and then a long-term plan to allow some of those, or many of those communities to also get exemptions from Act 250 doesn't accomplish the red tape cutting that you had hoped for and regulatory reform you hoped for to spur housing?
Right, well, again, from what I've heard, and this is a moving target in some respects, but what I heard was at one point, some of those longer term initiatives would come into play in like 28, 29, something like that, 2028, 2029, maybe 27. But they've been fast forwarded to 2025, 2026. So we're not going to have short-term gain for very long. And that concerns me, that they're accelerating the second piece of this, the long-term approach. And that's what I've heard in the House, what they're considering. So,
does that accelerate the time when communities can get permanent exemptions from Act 250?
yeah, but we're going to lose those short-term gains in the meantime. We need housing relief now. I mean, I thought we all campaigned on this, you know, not too long ago. I mean, we're not going to have it long enough to have an impact. We need housing today and tomorrow and the next year and the year after that. And putting in place, again, we'll weigh this all out, but this long-term approach that they're considering, I think will stifle housing.
Governor, at the top you mentioned that you were disappointed in the legislature's work on all three priority areas. In terms of the third one, public safety, what are you concerned about there?
Well, there's some good things happening there, but it's still in flux. So I'm really not sure what's going to actually pass in the long run. But there is some good news there. So we've done well on some things. Other things aren't being taken up. I think there are some studies that are being put into place. So all in all, I mean, it's not a deal breaker.
What do you consider the good news specifically?
The Senate in particular has worked with us on many issues that we put forward, and for the most part, again, I believe those will survive. But there's still a lot out there that we'd like to see. So I'm not really sure exactly what's going to pass. There's one bill I think I'll end up with soon. I think that one passed, that has most of what we'd asked for. So again, let's wait and see what we finish up with.
Safe injection site bill?
I've been pretty clear about that one. That's not, I'm philosophically and pragmatically opposed to that. I just think it moves us in the wrong direction. It's going to cost some money, and I know that's not out of the state coffers. This is part of the settlement money, but it's $1 million a year, and I don't think the safe injection sites will be put into, or the one site will be put into place for at least a couple of years. So we're going to be without that $2-3 million that we could put into prevention. to treatment, trying to put people on a better path now. So I just think that we should go with a strategy that we know works, that will help in the short run as well. So I just, that one is something that I'm opposed to. We'll see if they have the votes. I'm sure I'll end up vetoing that, and then we'll have to see if there's an override.
The health department is publishing new data, or year-end data, I should say, showing fatal overdoses statewide appear to be trending down for the first time since 2019. What do you make of that news?
It's good news, but we're still seeing deaths, right? So that's the bad news. We started to see that trend pre-pandemic the curve starting to go downward. And when we've seen it since the pandemic accelerate, but now we're seeing that come back down. So I hope that means some of the strategies we've put into place are working, and we hope that we can continue to do that and see that trend come down, because that's what we all want in the end.
Does it make you think about the safe injection sites, or even money for treatment or recovery or any other initiative differently, seeing the data appearing to go in one direction?
Well, it isn't. I felt this way before the data confirmed what I was thinking, that we have approaches we think are working with treatment, prevention. I'd like to see us do more in terms of prevention than we're doing now, harm reduction as well. So I'd rather put the money that they want to use for the safe injection sites into those areas that we know benefit us and benefit them.
Last question. The law enforcement and service providers that we speak with are seeing a pretty big uptick in methamphetamines, which is a much different drug than opioids, much different response. How is the state contending with that difference, that different drug?
Yeah, it's always, it's like playing whack-a-mole with the number of drugs that are coming out and becoming more popular. It was fentanyl, obviously, is still a huge concern for us. Xylazine all of a sudden rose to the top. The traditional drugs continue to still be a problem. So it's like all the above, and we continue to try and stay up, trying to stay as up to date as possible to do all we can to help people get through this. But it's difficult for the folks on the ground.
Supporters of this bill seem to think it's going to help save lives. Do you just fundamentally disagree with that assessment?
Well, it may save lives, but how many are we going to lose because we didn't get them into treatment or keep them from using in the first place with prevention? So again, that's our philosophical difference. But I think, again, we're all on the same page. We want to save lives. We just have a different outlook on how to do that.
Got a few folks on the phone. We'll start with Tom Davis, Compass, Vermont.
Thanks, Jason. Governor, the Biden administration recently launched a new broadband equity access plan that's going to release $900 million. They blocked Starlink last time as one of the potential providers, but this time each state is going to be able to pick their vendors. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I might see if, I know we talked about that previously, so I might ask Commissioner Tierney to weigh in on that one.
Thank you, Governor. What's been interesting in watching this area evolve is how things that were taken to be hard truths or showstoppers and the like have been revised as the federal government has dispersed this money. And so it doesn't surprise me that we now see second thoughts about things like Starlink, because at the end of the day, the objective is to get everybody affordable broadband. It may not yet be defined as a necessary public utility service in federal law, but there's wide agreement that it ought to be. And even if it isn't, it certainly should be treated that way. And so when you look at Starlink, as inferior as it may be in some people's opinion as a means of accessing broadband, when you have none at all, it looks very different. And so I think it is generally a good idea for there to be as much flexibility as possible. But the particulars about what is preferable as between 2 or 3 options is something really that should possibly be better addressed to the folks who are doing this work in Vermont, and that would be Director Hallquist at the Vermont Community Broadband Board.
Appreciate that. One question I have, it's interesting to hear, oftentimes in the research we've done about this, we found that the opinions about Starlink being inferior are based on their dislike of Elon Musk and not the actual facts. We have many readers who use Starlink, and I would say 99.5% of them are incredibly happy with the service and the price, and get very fast internet service, faster than some of the broadband companies are promising, with almost no outages and self-corrections. So I'm curious, will that process move from opinions to more data when they make that decision?
Well, Tom, not to argue with you, but I'm not sure I could agree that that other opinions have necessarily to date not been based on data. That's why it's important to consider who is giving you that opinion. And where Vermont is concerned, apart from what you just described, which is the experience of many people you're familiar with, it's also good to speak with the folks who, as I said, are doing the direct work on assessing this. I think, if I'm not mistaken, Director Hallquist has some personal experience with Starlink as well, and so it might be good to hear from her as too. But with that said, what you're pointing to is the advisability of making any such decision on the basis of fact and not on the basis of who you like or who you don't like, or what you think you know about a technology or not. So you're really zeroing in on a very important point in this discourse, because at the end of the day, very important that everybody gets something, and sooner rather than later.
I appreciate that. The one thing I did notice in some of the postings I see on social media, particularly from fairly well-known weather meteorologists in Vermont, is claims that Starlink doesn't work well for Vermont because it's too cloudy. Clouds have no impact whatsoever on satellite service. So it would be interesting. I think it's more about the ability for people who don't want to wait the very long time it will take us to do this wonderful broadband expansion for the entire state. So
yeah. Well, I think also
on this.
Yeah, I was going to say, in working in this area for as long as I have, one thing I have also learned is several apparently contradictory things can be true all at once. The meteorologist's experience can well be connected to cloudiness without clouds necessarily interfering with satellites, or being able to, and it can also be true that something that works very well for some people in some parts of the state simply doesn't work well for others. This is an argument that I have with the federal government all the time, because from their perspective, often policies got guided by what worked in Mississippi or Kansas, where terrain is very flat, for instance. So for what it's worth, I think the thing to do is to chase down as many sources as you can here, and secondly, to keep in mind that one size doesn't always fit all, but we're looking for as many sizes as possible.
Much appreciated, Secretary. No other questions.
Thank you. Back to you, Governor.
Keith, Rutland Herald.
Hi, regarding education tax costs, you might, I think if I've heard it said a double-digit increase is not what we want. Has anyone said what level of increase would be acceptable? I don't know if there's been a hard number thrown out there or what.
I go back to, I'd like to see it down to around the 4% range.
Okay, thank you.
Tim McQuiston, Vermont Business Magazine.
Hi, Governor. Following up on Jalva's and Bob's questions earlier about finding different funding sources, a lot of these taxes that are being proposed will never come down, as you well know, once they're established. But the income tax is something that has been flexible, very flexible over the years. I know that you would be opposed to any real tax increase, but could that be a horse trading option in the short term to, you know, get those property taxes paid down, or is there just too many obstacles at this point?
I agree with you wholeheartedly in terms of once you impose a tax, it never goes away. I remember when I was in the Senate, in fact, I probably voted for it. We increased the sales tax with the thought that there was a sunset on that. We're going to reduce that from 6, you know, we increased it to 6. It's going to go down to 5. That never happened. And I just don't believe any tax increase we put into place will ever be eliminated. But again, I want to stress that when we talk about educational reform, and we could have a conversation about different sources of funding, not just rely on property taxes, but from my standpoint, get to the structural reform first, take that approach, become as efficient as possible, but then incorporate a number of taxes, different taxes if we want, without increasing the costs. So we can rejigger in some respects where the money comes from without necessarily increasing our tax burden.
Thanks, Governor. Another question, just quickly. Bernie's running for re-election. Any thoughts on that?
I can't say that I'm surprised. He did contact me the other day to let me know, and I said that to him, that I wasn't surprised to hear. I will say this, longevity in the Senate is a gain for Vermont. We saw that with Senator Leahy. That's the way the power structure works in DC and in the Senate in particular. So I hope he continues because I think that it'll be a gain for Vermont. You get more power, we get more resources.
All right, great. Thank you, Governor.
Chris Roy, Newport Daily Express.
Good afternoon. No questions. Thank you.
Back to the room.
Governor, protesters in Middlebury took down their encampment earlier this week. Today we're learning that the vast majority of students at UVM are also going to be clearing out. Your initial, have you heard about this, your initial response?
I hadn't heard that they were taking down their encampment, but I think that's positive news. It's the end of their session, and they will be. We have commencement, I think, coming up in the next week or so, and so I think it would be better for the commencement, for the families coming to see their kids graduate. I think it would be better without all the controversy. So I think this is good news, and again, I'm thankful it was peaceful, and that was what I had said. I believe in the First Amendment, free speech, and the right to assemble. And as long as they're adhering to the rules, and it appears that they did so peacefully, and that's important.
UN Ambassador Linda Thomas Greenfield was no longer, that was one of the concessions. We don't know whether she pulled out or whether it was the school's decision, but she will no longer be the commencement speaker. I mean, how does that factor into this, do you think?
I have no idea whether it factored into UVM's decision, her decision, or the encampment, what they're doing. I just don't know. But again, Les, maybe from her perspective, she didn't want to cause a controversy. Maybe she reflected on the families and the parents and those kids that are graduating to have their day.
When you were discussing Bernie and the longevity in the Senate, you said, I hope he continues.
Yeah, well.
Yeah, it sounds like an endorsement.
It's not an endorsement, but at the same time, again, I know how the Senate works, and without that senior person in the Senate, in that position, we're at the bottom of the list, so to speak. We've learned that in real time with Senator Leahy retiring. He brought a lot to Vermont, and we're continuing to see that what he brought to the state, but as well, that's over at this point in time. So again, it's it's not an endorsement, but it doesn't surprise me, and I think it will be beneficial for Vermont. He's popular here in the state, and it'll be good for bringing resources into the state as well.
What do you make of the Progressive Party not too happy, saying you went against years of precedent, replacing their House Caucus leader, Emma Mulvaney Stanek, now mayor, with Abby Duke earlier? Like, what do you just make of their argument?
I don't know what to make of it, really. From my standpoint, I was just trying to make a decision. Emma had run and had sought the Democratic nomination, had received it, so she was actually a DP. And I felt an obligation to reach out to both parties, to have them forward names, and I picked the person that I think was ready for the position. And but I had good conversations with both sides, but I thought I was laughable in some respects when I was accused of playing politics with this, and I just don't see that to be the case. I mean, I'm going to get someone that's going to probably oppose everything that I do, regardless of the choice I made. So override every veto, or try to, and probably not sympathize with everything that I put forward. So if I wanted to play politics, I probably would have found a Republican that had never said they were a Republican and put them into place. That's playing politics. Choosing someone who has been a progressive Democrat in Burlington, I don't think it's playing politics. It's trying to be fair.
She was the head of the Progressive Caucus.
But she sought the nomination.
I understand, but you knew going into it by appointing. I mean, I've been on maybe 5 or 10 occasions. You've stood here and said you're not required by law to, when you do an appointment, to follow the party of the person, but you feel it's important to do that. She's clearly a progressive. You knew going into it by appointing a Democrat, you were going to ruffle some feathers here.
No, I did.
You did it anyway.
No, I didn't know that at all. No, and I don't agree with that. She sought the nomination to be on the Democratic ticket. She was a Democrat, progressive, right? From my standpoint, I don't know that you can. I totally disagree with your assessment, because I don't see how you can look at it any differently. You actively pursued the nomination of the Democrats and succeeded.
It may not
Makes you a
matter. I think
Democrat.
she goes by PED. She's a progressive and then a Democrat. So she counts herself as a progressive. She caucuses with the progressives, did Emma Mulvaney Stanek did. So,
But ran in the Democratic
that's true.
primary, not
That's
the
true.
progressive.
That is true.
It's just, again, I don't understand it, to be perfectly honest. We sent notices to both parties. They both knew it. Didn't hear a peep out of anybody until after I made the choice. If they were that concerned, I'm surprised they didn't raise the red flag then.
On another subject, back to the OPC subject again, please, Governor. You said that you would prefer to see the money dedicated to OPCs, which is $1 million, spent on treatment and prevention. But
And harm reduction.
Well,
And harm reduction.
and harm reduction. But that $1 million is coming from a tax on pharmaceuticals. Would you support a tax on pharmaceuticals to increase treatment, prevention, and harm reduction supplies?
Is it all coming from, and this is, I thought this was part of the settlement money. they were
I
receiving
was
that.
under the impression that the $1 million for the overdose prevention sites was coming exclusively from a new tax on pharmaceuticals.
I knew that there, at one time that was, but I believe, I may be wrong, maybe I should call a friend here pretty soon, but I believe that money comes from the settlement.
And I'm happy to be corrected on that.
Oh, me as well.
Yeah, Governor, Dr. Levine here.
Yes.
I believe you are correct that the original framing of the bill included the tax on the pharmaceutical industry, but the current framing is with opioid settlement money.
That's definitely true.
Well, at least by one source.
Governor, can we go back to H687 real quick? As you said, it's a moving target and there are things coming in and out of it, but of the amendments being discussed right now in the House, are there any in particular that you can point to that you would say are poison pills that if they're in the final version, it's a no-go for you?
Well, with the accelerated time frame for like the tier concept, that would be problematic for me. But there's others as well. We'll see. Again, I just want to leave the lines of communication open. We want to. I'd like to get to yes if we can, because the short-term gains could be beneficial to the state, and then we'll need to prove ourselves and hopefully extend some of the provisions in the future years. But we'll just have to wait and see. But we need some help right now.
Governor, if I could add on
Yeah.
this. I think they're currently discussing changing some of those amendments as we speak, so we're not even sure what's coming to the floor this afternoon. But most of what's in all of the amendments are fairly problematic and take several steps back from the past 7 version. So that would be a better way to phrase the question is there anything in it that we want to seek to keep? And I would say there's very little right now, based on the last drafts.
And I get this. They put a lot of time into this conservation bill in the House. They didn't have, their housing bill isn't connected with this. They had no housing in this. This was just their Act 250 conservation bill that they passed over to the Senate. The Senate added the housing pieces, which wasn't a surprise. I think I predicted that. But I think for political purposes, mesh the two together. So I can understand the House being protective of what they pass over to the Senate without, more consideration for the housing pieces.
The yield bill, as it stands, I know that I think there's a floor amendment coming this afternoon from Senator Brock, but would you veto it as it stands right now?
Yeah, without changes, yes.
Governor, back to school budgets. I know a few more revotes passed earlier this week. Does that encourage you, or do you see this as a recurring problem that's just going to keep needing to be, have mandates signed on it?
Oh, this, passing the budgets, and I feel for those communities that have to go through this. But without structural reform, we're going to be continuing this in the near future. That's why I'm being so adamant about doing something now and getting those structural reforms in place and not doing an 18-month study, doing something immediately and try and make sure that we protect Vermonters and taxpayers and students and teachers and so forth along the way. Finding this path for deferment, I think, isn't ideal, admittedly, but we're in this position, and this is the best path forward, I think, to protecting all interests.
Governor, that was a pretty interesting back and forth about Starlink and opinions of Elon Musk. Just curious to know, what's your opinion of Elon Musk?
Well, he's obviously a very controversial figure, but he's brought a lot to the economy, whether it's SpaceX or Tesla or Starlink. I mean, these are all beneficial to the world in some respects. So I admire him in some respects. I think some of the other pieces of his complicated puzzle can be problematic, and we could do without, but sometimes you have to take the good with the bad.
Governor, you said that you can live with the current iteration of the budget, the final iteration of the budget, but specifically the GA hotel housing program, how that was settled. How are you feeling about that?
Yeah, I mean, again, it's 20 million more than we had presented originally. It's $44 million right now for the GA program. As a reminder, pre-pandemic, I think we were around 7 million, but things have changed since then. So I'm happy that we came to some agreement on what the parameters are in the program itself. So I think we can make it work.
The Senate is not going to be taking up, because of the burden from the property tax issue, they're not taking up the expansion of Medicaid, the expansion of the judiciary, or the housing bill to create units over 10 years. I mean, I know you in the House are kind of philosophically maybe apart on how to pay for some of these issues, but you know, what's your reaction to those issues or those priorities not necessarily making it across the finish line?
Well, again, there's a number of issues every year that don't get across the finish line that disappoint many. There are a number of initiatives that the House had presented and passed in terms of new taxes and new programs and so forth that I don't mind seeing die on the vine, so to speak. So, again, we'll continue to focus on the big three for me: the affordability of Vermont, public safety, obviously, is important as well, and we'll continue to watch that as well. But this educational financing is going to be important.
How do you feel about how this legislative session went overall? Assuming it, unless we're back here next week, I don't know. But how are you feeling?
It's been a difficult session for everyone, I think, and you know, it started off with the December 1st letter, and I don't think that was taken seriously enough. And then I think there are many who, being the second half of the legislative session, see that they need to get things done, that they see a path forward, especially when you have a supermajority. It gives you that extra horsepower to get some of the things across the finish line. So that's made it, I think, even more difficult. So I think we'll see where it all ends up. I'm thankful the Senate took a more pragmatic approach in terms of the budget. That's going to be helpful, I think, and at least we get that passed, and hopefully, and we'll won't have to worry about any shutdowns at the end of the year.
Senator Baruth described it as a dark legislative session, storm clouds, property tax thing hanging over. I mean, would you agree that it's been a dark session? Like, how would you characterize it?
Yeah,
You've been through many sessions. It's just...
Yeah, but I've never seen one like this or experienced anything like this. This is just, there's a lot. There's a lot going on, and a lot, you know, moving that I never thought would move. To be honest with you, I thought at the beginning of the session when we saw that there was going to be a $225 million property tax increase to the tune of about 18%. It went up to almost 20% at one point. I thought the legislature would see the wisdom of maybe, let's just get through this, let's help that, fix that for Vermonters, and not push forward with all the other tax and spending initiatives. And that didn't prove to be the case. It seemed like they had doubled down at that point. So it's been an interesting one.
You said it feels different than sessions past. Why do you think that is, if you could put a finger on it?
I mean, it's always hectic, especially towards in the second half of the legislative term. But this has been, again, been a little bit different. I think having a supermajority, knowing that they can override vetoes, has just made it more problematic. And the expectations coming into, a November election, I think weighs into it as well.
Well, you've only got a couple of days left. Any words of advice or just thoughts about media coverage?
I will ask one thing. I'm not going to critique the media. I'm smarter than that. But I would ask that when you're reporting on these bills passing, that you not say that they're on the governor's desk at this point. The process, it takes a while. I mean, we don't get them for sometimes weeks after they're passed by the legislature. They go through their own process, through Leg Council and so forth, and then they have to be signed. So at times, it could be weeks before we get them. And I hear some of the reports that's sitting on my desk, and people are expecting, what are you going to do? Are you going to sign it? Are you not going to sign it? Why haven't you signed it? So I would just ask that you at least report that, it's not on my desk yet. Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you.